Hello and welcome to the Thinking Read podcast. I am Tom Vieira. This is episode 4 on Blaise Pascal. I'd like to start this episode with a couple words on the Pensée itself. If you have yet to go out and get the book, what are you waiting for? This is one of the most interesting and readable philosophy books ever written. I highly recommend the Penguin Classics version. There are various versions of the Pensée, and there are some pretty significant differences among them. You might recall in a previous episode, I mentioned that the notes that Pascal had prepared for what was to be a defense of Christianity, that was the Pensée. He never finished the book, and sort of notes scattered about in his room and were later cobbled together by his older sister and first published some years after he died. But in any case, you can imagine Pascal's scholarship over the years is something of an interesting story. And the versions of the Pensée vary a fair amount. I find the Penguin Classics version to be very well organized. It's very readable. So in any case, I will be using that as I go along, and it has its own organization system. There are numbers attached to each pensée or each aphorism, kind of a standardization of numbers. But then the Penguin Classics version has kind of applied its own organization to it, which I think is particularly useful. So in any case, if that's of interest to you, wonderful. Just bear in mind that as you read along in the work, and it's just, you kind of just start from the beginning and move forward, that, you're going to come across various things that he says that are really, sort of odd or maybe don't make a whole lot of sense. And you come across other things that you feel like you maybe even heard before. Pascal is often quoted. And that's okay. Just maybe just want to offer some reassurance, right? That perplexity while reading the Pensée is not an unusual experience. It's something of a patchwork. As you go along, or maybe think of it like puzzling pieces together, right? You go along and you're going to pick up different pieces of the puzzle, and they slowly connect. This is no systematic work of philosophy, so it's much more patchwork that way. In any case, I'm so glad you're here. Let's dive in. Has it ever occurred to you? Have you ever sort of just stopped and looked around? I do this, right? People watch, that sort of thing. And notice how distracted people seem to really like to. We want distractions. We find distractions. We enjoy watching endless YouTube videos, doom scrolling on our phones, endless football over the weekend, texting with friends constantly. We seem to want to do everything we can to not be alone. And so here we have a 400-year-old philosopher saying, across the centuries, as it were, that the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. That's from Pensée 136 in the Penguin Classics version. It's a really important Pensée, actually. I'll come back to another passage in that same Pensée in a little bit. I've mentioned that quote once or twice in the previous episodes, and it's a very famous quote from Pascal. And one of the reasons why I fell in love with reading the Pensée is because he says things that sound so very current. They're so very relevant, almost speaking directly into the experience of a 21st century person. We love to be distracted. We love our phones, if we were to be honest with ourselves. We love our phones, quite in large part for that reason. In that same Pensée, we read this. Telling a man to rest is the same as telling him to live happily. It means advising him to enjoy a completely happy state, which he can contemplate at leisure without cause for distress. It means not understanding nature. Thus, men who are naturally conscious of what they are shun nothing so much as rest. They would do anything to be disturbed. They would do anything to be disturbed. Is that you? I can relate. Why is this is really the question now, right? Why? What is driving the desire for distraction? Another pensée. And this is what I mean by, really trying to approach Pascal as a, you're sort of looking for clues and you're kind of piecing things together slowly over time. Okay. And so I'm actually bouncing around a little bit. I'm backing up in the pensée. Now I'm going back to number 36. He says this: anyone who does not see the vanity of the world is very vain himself. So who does not see it apart from young people whose lives are all noise, diversions, and thoughts for the future? But take away their diversion, and you will see them bored to extinction. Then they feel their nullity without recognizing it, for nothing could be more wretched than to be intolerably depressed as soon as one is reduced to introspection with no means of diversion. So we have a clue here. Pascal, true, Pascal comes long before modern psychological ideas of why we might be depressed, how, self-esteem issues, or, I don't know, maybe there's some physiological things. We tend to go in those sort of more therapeutic directions now. And it's completely it's completely out of the time, anachronistic, right? It's completely anachronistic to say, well, Pascal disagrees. He was not aware of these kinds of more modern psychological theories, but nevertheless, I think he would. Even if he were, I think Pascal would say, no, that's not really the issue. The issue is not that we lack mechanisms, therapeutic mechanisms to build up our confidence, that we don't really know the proper methods of self-care. We have, I don't know, toxic friendships or whatnot. What's underneath all of that and what drives the depression that we feel is that we don't know how to handle a genuine moment of reflection or contemplation. Let me read this one line again. Nothing can be more wretched than to be intolerably depressed as soon as one is reduced to introspection with no means of diversion. It's this, when we stop and we try to think seriously about life, that is not fun. That is to be immediately aware of what Pascal would describe as our wretched state. It's to be immediately aware of a real deep kind of misery that we have. And so we've got to unpack that misery if we're going to really get at something of an answer, a solution. These other things that we would turn to, Pascal would say those are all Band-Aid solutions, right? What's really underneath it all is that we have this wretchedness that we become really aware of when we try to answer questions that we don't have answers to. Let me take you to yet another passage. We're just kind of slowly unfolding the pensée here and getting more and more clues as we go along. Now to number 68. This is a stunning passage. I love this passage. When I consider the brief span of my life, absorbed into the eternity which comes before and after. The small space I occupy, which I see swallowed up in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I know nothing and which know nothing of me, I take fright and am amazed to see myself here rather than there. There's no reason for me to be here rather than there, now rather than then. Who put me here? By whose command and act were this time and place allotted to me? Some scholars like to think of Pascal as a kind of early existentialist, and it's because of passages like this. He sounds like he's having what we might now call an existential crisis. Why am I here? And this sort of, you feel something of your momentariness, your smallness in the vastness of space and time. What am I in the midst of all of this? Fair enough. I don't necessarily have an objection to thinking of Pascal as a kind of early existentialist. He was of some importance to existentialists that would come later on, like Søren Kierkegaard. What I really care most about is what he's trying to say here. That our experience of life and the world around us really offers us no final 100% completely rational solution or set of answers to those questions. We recall the last episode, right? That he really thinks the rationalistic mode of Descartes and others is a really mistaken way to try to think about life and to try to think about the human condition and about the world. Nature is ambivalent when it comes to giving us the answers that we really need about why we're here and so on. Where the reason is not going to solve that for us. Okay, and this is precisely the sort of thing that if we take our lives seriously, if we take the world seriously, we're gonna really think seriously about those hardest questions. It's this kind of question that we're confronted with, which is why we don't want to deal with it. We just will run to distractions. We would rather do other things than to really contemplate this reality, because the reality is that you are a moment in time. You are small in contrast to the vastness of the universe, and our understanding of how vast the universe is now is remarkably different, right, than what Pascal had, right? So it's almost an all the more so. So we have a clue here in terms of why we don't want to think, why we really do anything but thinking. All right, let's move to one more passage, this time Pensée 47. Here, Pascal is going to talk about what do we think about? Because we can talk about, diversions we run to. I mentioned, endless football, right? Or, hanging out with friends, playing video games, whatever it is. Pascal has this one, sort of didn't mention this, but I'll bring this up because I think it's a really interesting example. He brings up gambling. We go hunting, we go gambling, it's kind of the examples he brings up. And the gambling one is really interesting because he says, look, you take somebody who gambles, right? And let's just say, they were going to gamble every day this week. And he says, okay, take that person and whatever winnings they would have each day, okay, try to arrange with them where you give them the money. Let's say you were able to give them the money that they would win on the condition that they weren't able to gamble, and they would not be happy. They wouldn't be happy because it's not the money they want, it's the diversion they want. That's a fascinating argument, right? It's a very interesting point that he's making there, that's sort of cutting right to the core insight here about how we how we actually live if we're being honest with ourselves. Okay, so I mentioned Pensée 47, and it's in this Pensée where he says, what do we think about? We think about the past or the future, but never the present. We don't want to be in the present. We love the future. We sometimes go to the past, but we really like the future. He says we never keep to the present. We recall the past. We anticipate the future, as if we found it too slow in coming and we're crying to hurry it up. Or we recall the past, as if to say it's too rapid flight. We are so unwise that we wander about in times that do not belong to us, and do not think of the only one that does. So vain that we dream of times that are not, and blindly flee the only one that is. The fact is that the present usually hurts. That's a great line. The present hurts. Skipping forward a little bit, we almost never think of the present. And if we do think of it, it is only to see what light it throws on our plans for the future. The present is never our end. The past and the present are our means. The future alone our end. Thus we never actually live, but hope to live. And since we are always planning how to be happy, it is inevitable that we should never be so. That's fascinating, right? That's really interesting that the extent to which we are in the present or think about the past, it's all with a means to a hoped for future. It's a fairly common idea, I think, but Pascal is going to get somewhere with this idea, somewhere I think really important, and it's where I'm going to end this segment, because when we give that some thought, that where we tend to go is a future state, a hoped for state. There's an argument in this that Pascal sees, because we're left with the question, right? Okay, so I get it, Pascal, that we have these, deep questions, these, and we don't seem to really be able to answer them. Reason doesn't really immediately afford clear answers. Descartes isn't going to be the right solution here. Fair enough. Let's just say I agree with that. Is there any kind of clue here? Are we just left with a complete state of darkness? And Pascal doesn't think it's just, we're just absolutely clueless and there's no real indication. I think all of this will lead Pascal to form this great question. Okay. And, so I'm going to move forward to the critical Pensée, I think, for this topic. It's in Pensée 131. Okay. And it's another longer one. And the answer that Pascal gives lies in the human being as a kind of paradox. Now, I discussed this in episode 1 on this series, that human beings are odd for Pascal. We are both very, very fragile, and we're remarkable. Anything could kill us, right? We're very vulnerable to circumstantial factors, and yet we can contemplate the heavens. And he says at one point that man's greatness is in the fact that we can realize that we're wretched. That is a pretty remarkable thing. That passage that I read just a minute or two ago about how we can sense the infinity of time and space, even. That surrounds us. We know our smallness, but it's the fact that we can even know that is an amazing thing in and of itself. Okay, so there's that paradox, and so it's in this Pensée that we get this passage that I covered in episode 1 about what sort of freak then is man, how novel, how monstrous, how chaotic, how paradoxical, how prodigious, judge of all things, feeble earthworm, repository of truth, sink of doubt. And error, glory, and refuse of the universe. Okay, so there's that level of the paradox, but as you go on in this pensée, he's going to actually dig down deeper into, let's call it sort of the existential, which is, you know, the realm of experience, you know, the way in which we feel life, experience life. And he says there's actually a duality there as well that really is a key to how we can address this misery. So we read here that he says, "Know then, proud man, what a paradox you are to yourself. Be humble, impotent reason. Be silent, feeble nature. Learn that man infinitely transcends man. Hear from your master your true condition, which is unknown to you. Listen to God." Okay, so he's going to get into this idea of kind of like this dual nature. And he will, when he says listen to God, you know, this is, in his mind, this is an argument for Christianity. And again, it's not an argument grounded in some sort of syllogism, right? Like a Cartesian style rationalistic proof. It's grounded in our experience. So look, if you go within yourself and you kind of search your heart, you're going to find some clues that will point you in the direction that I think you really need to go. It's the only direction, and he thinks it's the direction of Christianity. But let's kind of hear what he has. Let's hear his argument. He says, "Is it not clear as day that man's condition is dual? The point is that if man had never been corrupted, he would, in his innocence, confidently enjoy both truth and felicity. And if man had never been anything but corrupt, he would have no idea either of truth or bliss. But unhappy as we are, and we should be less so, there are no element of greatness in our condition. We have an idea of happiness, but we cannot attain it. We perceive an image of the truth and possess nothing but falsehood, being equally incapable of absolute ignorance and certain knowledge. So obvious it is that we once enjoyed a degree of perfection from which we have unhappily fallen." Okay. So there is in this picture the idea of the fall of man, right? This kind of Christian idea, but he doesn't start there. He sort of ends with that, right? Where he starts is in the realm of our own experience of life. So what is this duality that we experience? He says, we both experience this misery, this unhappiness, but also a longing for truth, a longing for happiness. It's why he says we think about the future. We're always thinking about the future, right? A hoped for better state sometime later. We know it's not now, right? And he says, look, if we had never been corrupted, we would only have truth and felicity. And we know that's not true. But he says on the other side, he says, if we had never been anything but corrupt, we would never have any idea of truth or happiness. We have both. We have both misery and a desire or a longing for happiness and truth. And so his great question is this. He says, what position, what view best answers that basic existential reality that we have? And he thinks it's Christianity. Christianity is the only religion in which we have both a kind of happiness and a kind of lost paradise, right? A sort of the entrance of misery into the world, where we have both of these factors now within the human heart. Okay. Regardless of where you go with that argument, it is fascinating to think about, right? Why do we pursue distractions? Why do we seem so intent on pastimes rather than taking seriously the present time? I hope you enjoyed this episode. Our question is to think or not to think. I hope you join me next time. Bye for now.